He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man, the dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. These old things.
All right, George Bagby,
Okay.
Welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
I'm doing wonderful. It's great to be with you again.
Yeah, I'm very glad to have you on. You and I have been doing sort of an informal, longer series about the different populations in America. I mean, honestly, for over a year now, somewhat infrequently. But this is something more topical, something you wanted to bring up directly. And so I figured I'd just hand the floor to you.
So I wanted to talk about what's going on in private schools, which is the only kind of education I have any direct connection with. I'm interested in diagnosing the problems and identifying ways forward, at least for dissident educators, which is mostly homeschoolers these days, though there are good private schools out there still. So I penciled down what I call the neocon influence in private education. And this is an important thing for us to consider because we have the conservatives. And I think that this has been a big part of our discourse these days, where we've seen some unmasking of the conservatives. We've seen an apocalyptic moment for the conservative American. And we've all found ourselves asking the question, just what are they trying to conserve? And the answer, inevitably, is something of the establishment. They're trying to shore up a system that has failed, a number of particular beliefs, mostly from the previous generation, which we should understand. It was the investment in those beliefs that caused the creation of a great number of Christian schools of all stripes, of church-supported schools. The classical school movement is very much invested here, and that is not to malign anyone invested there. I have friends there. I have a shout out to a special someone out there, part of a charter school, who reached out to me because he listens to this podcast and wanted to hire me. And I have nothing but gratitude for that particular person and many other people in the classical schools, the charter schools and such. There are a great many charter classical schools that cannot talk specifically about religious faith, but nevertheless are trying to do things. But the neoconservative, or we might just call them all conservative, investment, the political perspective, is something that we must face. So one of my key influences as an educator is C.S. Lewis's little book, The Abolition of Man, which I think is essential reading. And it has particular importance for an educator. Lewis's cause for writing this book was a book of literature education. It starts out as a piece of criticism about a book for education. He gives the writers of the book, the actual authors of the text he's criticizing, he gives them some Roman names, and then he picks apart something that they are making the foundational instruction in their text. The story he tells is very evocative. He says that they quote Samuel Coleridge, the poet, and the poet looks at a waterfall and calls it sublime. He calls it incredibly beautiful and lovely. And the authors of the school text say Coleridge is actually talking about his own private feelings when he says that this is beautiful. Lewis says this is the process of debunking. And what they are debunking is any sense of absolute objective value, that anything is worthy of the attribution sublime. In effect, whenever we apply a value judgment to something, we're only saying something about our own private feelings. And Lewis says this makes the value attribution ultimately meaningless. Lewis says that the educators in this context, they have cut the soul out of their students long before he is old enough to understand the possibility of having a certain experience, of actually seeing objective value in anything and correctly describing it. And this was an inspiration for me. I always took this book very seriously. I first encountered it as an undergraduate. And as a teacher, I often read it and reflected on what I was doing. So I started my career teaching literature, American history, and government. Thankfully, I got ancient literature, which I couldn't have asked for anything more permanently valuable. I taught Sophocles and Homer. I taught Dante in my literature survey. And in the course of my career, I suddenly discovered when that first teaching post wrapped up for me, my contract was not renewed after 7 years of teaching the same classes. I had discovered in those last years that it wasn't just the parents who had ingested this debunking spirit that Lewis had talked about. It was not just the students who frequently came to me already believing in an ideological way that the debunking was the essence of freedom and liberty. It was even the administrators of the school who had internalized that kind of belief. And that was the kind of thing they were trying to preserve in their institutional work. They wanted to preserve a format, a perspective that essentially allowed for that. And the conflict I found myself in with initially students, then parents, and finally the administration was the point of debunking and whether or not we could make value attributions. So Lewis talks about this in his book, that ultimately these value attributions, these are the unsentimental sentiment, as Weaver had it in Ideas Have Consequences. This is the essential faith, the dogmatic belief, if you will, in the permanent, enduring human value of families, of loyalty to friends, of partiality to one's own homeland, to one's own kinfolk, of faith in God, of the devotion of religion. And it ultimately can only replace them with sophistry, which is this rationalistic argument that undermines the foundations of all of those values. what is Lewis's primary purpose in his book, The Abolition of Man, where he's saying the undermining of all those values destroys the essential elements of a human being. These are the things that make life worth living. These are actually the foundations of culture itself. And all of these things, these sophistical debunking process, this rationalized criticism of these things destroys the harmony of a society. So I discovered that this kind of sophistical arguments for argument's sake about values was not something that even the leaders of the school were prepared to contend about. In spite of the slogan of the school where I first began my teaching career, they had taken me in as a rookie without any teaching experience. They gave me my chance, and I taught for them for 7 years. And that was an incredibly happy and productive time in my life. I was able to welcome 2 children into my family. I was able to buy my first home because of that, and I have incredible gratitude for all of it. It was what made me the professional I am now. The slogan of that school was various absolute aspects: truth, beauty. Those are how they described them. That was how they described themselves. And it was a stunning moment when I realized that these things were adjustable. And this is the situation that administrators, any administrator anywhere, will recognize: the wide path, the latitude that must be maintained to keep your institution from being an esoteric concern, something that does not have enough appeal to keep it operating. And this is something I did not understand as a teacher. I was just devoted to my subjects and trying to explain them the best I could. But as an administrator, you're thinking about the bottom line necessarily. You're trying to maintain the budget, and you must know your audience and so on. You are recruiting students, you're admitting students, you're trying to graduate the students. You don't want people to be alienated. You don't want them to be falling off. And this is one of the great challenges of education now, because the great temptation of the teacher, as it is for the administrator, the great temptation is the sin of flattery. It's that of lying to people for your own advancement. And every teacher will face that when they have to grade something. And I found myself in my last years of teaching, if I was giving something lower than a B, I needed to visit several administrators and make sure that I had them on my side, because invariably there would be a parent that would be very upset. They would want a meeting with the administrator, and their line of attack was very familiar. They would say, "What are we paying you for? And you're giving my daughter a C, an F. What are we paying you for? You're obviously doing something wrong. We've invested here," and so on. Now, that's a minority that does that, but they determine an awful lot about how things operate, because if a teacher is going to give the grade on an objective level, the paper was illegible. You couldn't sit and read it. It was so incomprehensible. It did not contain valuable information. It did not fulfill the basic requirements of the assignment, and so on. That's one thing. But if it's a philosophical difference, I'm giving assignments concerning objective values, most often in literature, which is my subject today. The individualist, the liberal of the modern day, will say, well, the authorities of whatever circumstance, who are they to tell the hero how he should act? He is striking out. He is being a fearless individual with his own line of reasoning. And that is heroic. I will apologize for the hero. Now, said coherently, that wouldn't necessarily be a bad paper. But the message in the class was that of the objective social values that Lewis describes. So Lewis, in his book, he says, until quite modern times, all teachers and even all men believed the universe to be such that certain emotional reactions on our part could be either congruous or incongruous to it. Believed, in fact, that objects did not merely receive, but could merit our approval or disapproval, our reverence or our contempt. The idea is restated in Aristotle that the aim of education is to make the pupil like and dislike what he ought. That this is not something that's finally up to them. And this could not have been better matched with my own literature material. I was teaching Oedipus Rex. I was teaching some Hesiod. I was teaching Homer's Iliad. And finally, the last great poem in the class was Dante's Inferno. All of them concern these absolute values, the transgression of which leads to ultimately eternal punishment, something implied even in the Greek pagan texts. So it was extremely appropriate for the subject matter, and it was the overarching theme of the class. That is where I fell into trouble. I was teaching the Ordo Amoris, which Lewis also mentions, something that needs to be on the forefront of our thought on these things, and ultimately of incredible political importance, the properly ordered social loves and regards, that we prefer our own family, that we prefer the people we share with, our friends, the people that we are in community with. We prefer them to the outsider, to the dissenter, to the foreigner, to those outside of our own communities. And that this is the fundamental order of society. To have these properly ordered loves is of incredible significance. And that, in fact, the Ordo Amoris, according to St. Augustine, according to Aristotle, according to Plato, according to Thomas Aquinas, these are the basic elements of education itself. This is what education is for. To teach us what is good, what is bad, to teach us what our duties are, to teach us where our loyalties must lie, which ensures the future of any community. Communities all have limited resources. They must allocate those resources properly based on the proper sentiments. And if they do not do so, they will be pillaged. They will be destroyed. They will not form families. They will not provide for their children. They will not stand by for their friends, and so on. So this is such a fundamental thing, and it it struck me long before I was a teacher. It struck me as so profound and so needful. It was a root of my classes. I was very devoted to this. I took Homer's Iliad as an example. In Book 9 of Homer's Iliad, Achilles is confronted with a procession of emissaries. Achilles has separated himself from the fighting. He claims he does not care if his companions live or die in the siege in front of Troy. He is offended by Agamemnon. Agamemnon has publicly embarrassed him and humiliated him. And he's staying in his tent and sulking, with cultivating his anger against this slight, against this public dishonor. And his friends come to him. They're sent by Agamemnon. Agamemnon admits that he was wrong. He pledges to restore everything to Achilles. And more, he wants to make amends. He promises Achilles the authority over cities. He promises Achilles gold bars, racing horses. He promises Achilles cauldrons and tripods. Unusual gift in our conception. Why would you want giant barbecue sets? But the reason being that the ability to entertain large groups is something that consolidates political and social status. It gives you authority. If you can feed large numbers of people, then you have increased clout. He promises Achilles even his own daughter, making him an heir. There really isn't anything else conceivable that Agamemnon could promise to Achilles to make amends. And yet Achilles refuses to be reconciled. Now, the responses to this are very interesting. We see a long series of speeches in Book 9 of the Iliad. And this was an occasion for me for a major essay assignment. I had my students for many years, they would write an essay in response to this. And the whole point of the essay was the ordo amoris, the properly ordered loyalties, sentiments. The response from Odysseus is the most important of all of them. Odysseus is the first one to speechify to Achilles. He says, Achilles, Agamemnon wants to make amends. Human beings offend one another, but we have to keep living. We must make amends with one another. We make amends for any wrong that could possibly be done, for greater wrongs than were done to you. He says, Agamemnon has offered you all of these things, but consider the other motives you have to comply. Your father himself, he told you to guard your anger, to not let anger consume you. You were told, you were given this role. You are a soldier. You must care what happens to your friends, what happens to your comrades, what happens to your whole community. You must care about whether they live or die. That is part of your essential duty as a soldier. You cannot be in it only for yourself. And he tells Achilles that he has got a responsibility for his community, for his friends, and that he has a responsibility to his father, who ordered him and who has proper authority over him. So he makes this very good appeal. Then we have at the tail end, we have Ajax, the warrior, who makes the final speech, and it's the shortest of the speeches to Achilles. Ajax says, Achilles has a heart of stone. It is not like a human heart. He does not care for his friends. He is like is like vegetable matter. He does not have warmth in his heart, a very important theme in Homer. To have warmth in your heart towards the right ends. This is a powerful symbol in Homer for that correct sentiment, that proper orientation of loves. And Ajax says to Achilles, he says, a man will reconcile even for his murdered brother. And yet Achilles says he cares about nothing but for his own regard. And I would give that to them and send them out to write a paper. And the goal is to recognize this order of values. Achilles eventually rejoins the battle, but not for the reasons you might think. He does not reconcile with Agamemnon initially. It's only when his friend Patroclus, a soldier who cares for his friends, who cares whether they live or die, he goes and fights in Achilles' armor and he is killed. What is more natural than a soldier going into battle and then dying? But Achilles will not be reconciled to that. He goes and has his vengeance on Hector, who had killed Patroclus, and only reconciles with his community after that point.
There are several things there.
Yes, indeed.
I think it's interesting. You may remember, I guess this would have been almost a year ago now, when suddenly, everyone on the political left was very concerned about this idea of Ordo Amoris because J.D. Vance mentioned it in a speech. And what's interesting to me is that there are certain things that we as moderns, and I certainly include the sort of conservatives we're talking about, are very comfortable with. And so, for instance, in the example of Achilles, it's like, oh, well, there's a very comfortable narrative, which is partially true. It is an aspect of what's going on, which talks about the rage, the arrogance of Achilles. But the element that you were talking about, the incorrect privileging, right, putting your own above, or putting your own honor from a certain perspective above your filial piety, your duty to those around you. It's a much more uncomfortable. That's a more uncomfortable thing for that sort of system of values to poke at. And I think it's interesting. This is maybe slightly less relevant to Homer directly, but it's something that you mentioned it before, which is, to what extent is Western civilization valuable? Well, is it valuable as sort of a dressing, right? As part of the process of finishing, your son or daughter into, a member of the upper middle class? Or does it have intrinsic worth? Do you owe something to your civilization? And I think that dissonance, that gap between stated and revealed preference is very important, right? Like, why are we going through, this sort of ritual of learning Homer? Are we doing it because it's something that you can bring up in a college application essay and wow the recruiter? I mean, obviously it probably wouldn't work now, but hypothetically, or is it learning about something that is important, right? The building blocks of the civilization which birthed you, something that is inherently better than other things, is preferable to them. I don't know. I kind of threw a bunch at you there, Bagby. I didn't want to interrupt the stream of thought, but I realized there were multiple things that I wanted to say earlier and I hadn't gotten to.
Yes, absolutely. And this was the impetus for one of the very first questions on my midterm review, when I was going over big questions that I want them to consider, because I'm trying to set them up for essay questions on the midterm. I asked them at the first part of the review, it was a reference to my initial introductory lecture in the class. I said, when someone describes something beautiful, are they talking about something real that you can see, that you can appreciate? Or are they only talking about their own private feelings? That was my question. And this is ultimately the reason why we would teach Homer, because Homer is talking about things of eternal quality, and most certainly things directly concerning Westerners. What is a Westerner? What sets them apart? What things do they believe? What have they cultivated for thousands of years? And Homer is a wonderful introduction to these things, discussing, Bronze Age warriors and the rest. It nevertheless isolates those things. And we see that with the Odyssey. One of my favorite examples from Homer, Odysseus is tempted by Circe, the goddess who loves him. She is eternally young. And she offers him the greatest bribe ever encountered in literature. She offers him immortality and eternal youth if he is to stay with her. And what does he do? He embraces his own mortality, which is also what Achilles does, by the way. He knows he will die. He knows that the best part of his life is already past. His own vitality is fading. He is now older. He is now, around 50 or something. He wants to go home. He wants to see his own aged father. He wants to raise his son. He wants to see his wife. He wants to restore his authority and his estate. And he turns down Circe, the goddess, who offers him limitless pleasure because he wants his home, because that offers him the greatest satisfaction, to deliver his home from those that would despoil it, to save his son from those that want to kill him. And he has no assurance of success in that quest. He does succeed, and that's why the Odyssey is so inspiring. And the gods are intervening on his side because his cause is just. But this is the ultimate question, these great values. I love that particular example of Odysseus in the Odyssey. But the ultimate question is those enduring qualities. And this was what first got me into serious trouble. That essay or that exam review question to set them up for that essay question. My students are mostly, like anyone in any time, they're a product of their time. They are liberals, as are the administrators. They believe that there's a bunch of different ideas out there, and it is the province of the individual to choose among them, to hear them in discussion, and also not to be told which one is right, which one is just. So theoretically, they'll entertain the debate between the atheist and the theist. They'll entertain the debate between the materialist and the orthodox believer who says there is a spiritual realm. There are eternal values. They'll entertain the debate between the communist and the liberal. And they think, oh, well, this is all free and we're going to let the best one win. But they do this for children. And there's a certain level where we must encounter unfamiliar ideas and entertain thoughts and the rest. We see even at the college level, this is something that is still very powerful because the established course is so very powerful. We conform to the authority. And it's very rare to encounter someone that doesn't. This is why it matters where we invest with education. But even in the Christian high school, there is this strong conviction that no one should tell them what to believe. Even when it comes to things like the authority of the parents, the adherence to the faith of their Christian church, loyalty to their homeland, and so on. The idea is more like John Stuart Mill's, very subversive. The idea that everyone should be a totally free actor with nothing to compel his allegiance. And when I gave that question one particular year, I remember so well because it led to a kind of scandal. I still had years of teaching ahead of me. But I gave that question to the class, and in the exam review, things went out of control. I had a student question me initially, saying, well, you say a statement of value is a recognition of some objective fact, at least potentially, and not a reference to one's own preferences or feelings. What if I prefer something else? And I asked for the context. Now, this is the same class where I was teaching Dante, and of course in Dante we're talking about sexual morality. And that was something that comes up in the class. She said, well, I have friends that like to sleep around and they use contraception in high school. What do you think of that? And I said, well, that seems to be a bad course of life because we have sexual relations with people. We're connected with that individual for the rest of our lives, whether or not we want it. Which is one of the reasons why we don't even have to have sex. We will feel connection to those we've united with emotionally, those we've imagined ourselves with in some respect. So I was talking in those terms, and I got a very spirited response from several. It was a minority. Most of the students did not relate to what was being said, but it was a minority of students that were so inspirited by this. Something that we had talked about, by the way, we were talking about the circle of lust in Dante, for instance, where we see these tormented lovers united together in a kind of punishment. They're weeping, though they're embracing. They're weeping. And they are adulterers. They are, famous people from history that Dante describes. And I would point to them and say, this is the kind of torment of a failed relationship, a breakup, where you're united to someone, but it only causes you grief to remember. And it wasn't something that exploded at the time. It seemed more acceptable in the context. But in this other context where it was brought up, it was a point of controversy. I had another student who was much less thoughtful on the question. She spoke up. She said, "What about our food preferences? What if I prefer to eat candy instead of the meal for dinner?" And I said, well, that's actually a very good example. This is a very objective example. You eat junk, and you're made unhealthy, and that causes suffering. We know what you ought to eat. This is not a question at all. I had a long drawn out meeting. It went to the administration because I was telling the students that they couldn't eat refined sugar because it was their preference, because of objective value. And it was the role of the teacher to tell them how they ought to live. But it came down to the absurd example of lollipops as a substitute for a square meal. That was the example that was brought up in class. The most controversial question, aside from the sexual one, which had its own angry meetings with parents concerning, they thought I was being inappropriate. And I believe I acquitted myself on the point. But the most controversial question, aside from that, was I said, I believe it had to have been in discussion in class. I don't think I ever wrote this down. But I was looking for an example of bad art. And I was thinking of something egregious. Specifically, I was thinking of something that I did not believe any parent in my school would go to bat for, would immediately see my point and find it obvious. Because I did not want controversy on the question, and I realized things were touchy and worrisome. I was concerned about the response I was getting from this minority of my students. So I said, it's like saying that Lady Gaga is not worth your time or study, that it's wasteful and ugly, objectively, and that in music, you could devote your life to the study of Mozart, and that would be a worthy use of your time. Whereas Lady Gaga is disgusting and is not worth even your 5 minutes to listen to a song. Well, that got an uproarious response. I had several passionate students. I had touched on something they liked, which I did not anticipate. This was before Lady Gaga sang the national anthem for Biden's inauguration, which I found especially appropriate after my Lady Gaga thing, something I talked about for years, that I staked my reputation on the ugliness of Lady Gaga and lost credibility with my employers. I contended and said that this is analogous to the full meal, the square meal with vegetables and protein, and the lollipops. But it's even worse. It's really like shit. It's like eating shit. And this got me into serious hot water. It wasn't the word I used to describe with my students, but is nevertheless what I believe. That very day, I walked down the hallway and I encountered another teacher, the mother of one of the students who had contended with me that day. And I said, oh, I had an interaction. I suspected this was going to come back at me. I said, I was talking with your daughter today. In the midst of this, her daughter walks up. I hadn't seen her there. She walks up. She had already told her mother about her interaction with me. And her mother says, yes, you were telling her what she ought to eat. This is a high school student with her mother. And her mother says, yes, you were telling her that she had bad taste in food. And her daughter is standing right there to accuse me in front of her mother. She says, yes, he says, I don't know what I ought to eat. And I said to the mother in all seriousness, we were talking about lollipops versus a meal. Thinking this is going to get respect. And she says, no, if my daughter wants to eat something, it's her business. You have no say. And what's all this nonsense about objectivity about this, that there are things that are worth eating and things that are not worth eating? And I said, well, the question is a little more complex than that. I even brought this into our discussion in the class. I said, dark chocolate would be better than lollipops because there's more to taste, because it's a more sophisticated enjoyment. And her mother said, well, that's just bigotry. And then I had some meetings. I had several meetings after that with aggrieved parents whose students went home to tell them about my Lady Gaga opinion. I had one parent that came in to say, oh, well, all that Beethoven stuff, that's all fine, but you can't tell anybody what they should like. I had a parent that said, I have never heard of Lady Gaga. And I quote, never heard of Lady Gaga, but I'm going to tell my children to listen to her, so that they won't be a bigot like you. Which just made my eyes pop out. I did not, and that was my ultimate mistake. I did not know my audience. I didn't know ultimately who I was teaching for. And this is the bigger problem, because this is the mainstream, and it doesn't need to be the preponderance. It does not need to be the 50%. It need only be a few. And that, with a school that's reliant on tuition, which is really the only thing we would have to work with any sort of dissident sphere, it's enough to end a career.
There are several things there, and it's funny to me because when you say the term like neoconservative, it's tough because there's both a specific and a generalized meaning to that. For instance, like in this context, we're basically just talking about like normal conservatives, right? Like conning types versus like the actual literal neoconservatives. Because one of the things that I find so funny is that if you actually go into, like real, neoconservative philosophy, one of the things that they are quite concerned about is the decay of objective morals, right? They view relativism as what's being wrong with our country. And it's interesting to me that, many of the people who would either champion their beliefs explicitly or just by osmosis have discarded that core central tenet and have basically, kind of kept this kind of very, watered down form of cultural conservatism, where it's basically just, it's progressivism, but without the gay stuff. And even then, there's kind of a ratchet and prawl that, many on the right have discussed. That the values of yesterday's conservatives are completely and totally unacceptable. And I mean, I think that the bigger problem in all of this, right, is again, right, like why do people send their children to private education? Do they do that to raise their children outside of the influence of modern culture, the regime, as we would say it, or to accredit them? And that's a problem that needs to be addressed, because if the answer is simply to accredit them, well, they've got you by the nose, because you can't ever do anything too outside of, higher education. You can't do anything that goes against them too much, because then you'll never be allowed to index with that system. Similarly, I think that this has sort of been improved, but talking to other people at similar institutions, it seemed like COVID was sort of the worst time for this, because effectively what you had is many of these private schools were effectively one of the only educational institutions that was open. And so what happened, at least as far as I've had it explained to me, is that a whole bunch of kids got sent there because their parents wanted them to go to any school. And so you had a lot of that, sidestepping of the traditional gatekeeping, right? Someone's like, well, I don't care if it's a crazy religious school. I just want my kid there. And then that begins to metastasize. I think it's a difficult thing because there does need to be some sort of gatekeeping. And this becomes incredibly difficult, less so now, but when you have a hostile administration and effectively a whole office of the DOJ that exists to ruin the life of anyone who says you can't send your kid here if you're a lesbian. Like, that's not what we want. You can't send your trans kid here. And so it's a really precarious position to be in, because as I'm sure you know, Bagby, scandal can kill a school like that. One that is entirely elective. They don't get federal funds. It's not like they can just fire someone and completely dodge responsibility. And so I don't say this to let these people off the hook, but they are in a tough situation. And I think that especially if you've imbibed and this is something that I've spoken with Cryptos about before, but if you've imbibed the value system of managerialism, right? The idea that the purpose of any institution is to grow incrementally bigger, to find metrics and improve them, however arbitrarily those are defined. Well, are you going to say no? Are you going to say, we don't care, we're sorry, your child is no longer welcome here? I've seen schools do it, but it's rare, especially rare when money is tight, to be brutally honest. But I'll kick it back to you.
Indeed. And those practical considerations ensure the survival of those institutions. And I've been close enough to the administration. I was finally an administrator myself, though I didn't have much to do. I sat in the meetings, but it ensures the survival. And so there are compromises made on that level, which I understand, because you want to make payroll. You believe that you are doing a measure of good. And given the norms, the norms are always important to note. The norms determine what will fly. And in the administrator's perspective, and I heard this from an administrator on an occasion, and I still remember it. He said, look here, you're teaching Dante. Dante is full of things they are not going to buy. Consider the greater good. And what he was communicating to me is, don't harp on the controversial parts. Now, and this is also where I look back on my own career, and I was thinking, I'm thinking now, if I was not so mission driven, because I thought that the administration would back me up, and was not aware of their practical concerns, I could have had a longer career. It's only in my mistakes that I was able to see this, truly. But it was through these hostile meetings that I really first realized the seriousness that to have a preference will be called bigotry. That the individual moral preference, the idea that a child can have moral agency and choose some philosophy of ethics, that an immature youth can be a philosopher of ethics for their own lives, can decide what's ultimately good, has created such an untenable position in education. Now, the best proposal I've ever heard, and I'm still very taken with it, came from another administrator, a friend, who I'm still in touch with. This person said, we need to have an elite tier. And I still think that that is a wonderful way to go forward. So the elite tier would be to teach the literature, as I did, but not ask for any recognition of an order of goods. That would be the mainstream tier. That would be the general admission class. The elite tier, which this person proposed, would be the upper grades. Maybe if it was a large enough school, it could be a more exclusive set alongside the upper grades. But the person said the elite tier should be invitation only. It must be exclusive. And there, we can actually require essays. And we can teach them what they should believe about a particular point. Now, and this is such a larger problem. And this is why, traditionally, schools were organized on sectarian lines, and schools were explicitly religious. Because on a point of controversy, especially in theology, we can all understand this easily. The supreme truth about God and your role in the universe. That different Christians will have different answers based on their explicit loyalties. Therefore, they organized on sectarian lines so that they could all be on board with the highest thing and all say the same thing. In our condition, we are trying to organize people of common cultural loyalty are trying to organize something together. And this puts Catholics and Protestants and Orthodox like me all thrown together. And so we overlook those sectarian differences, and there is a kind of liberality. But what I saw in my own experience, the cultural liberality will always have the greater importance. The freedom of the youngster to be their own philosopher of ethics. That is the grounds. It's not going to be the Catholic insisting on a Catholic point of theology. In our condition, that is quaint. As one of my students said when I was talking about the music, one of my students said, well, Mr. Bagby, you're talking about something that, well, in music, I was saying Beethoven's better than Lady Gaga. I made another analogy. I said, well, Shakespeare is better than USA Today, because we throw away USA Today every day. No one will pick it up again and look at what they said, because it's not of enduring quality. Every once in a while, a journalist writes something that we will reference again, but it's quite rare. It's disposable, right? And that had adherents. I won a point in the argument. They responded well to that. But one of the students raised hand and said, well, Mr. Bagby, you're talking about stuff that's written down. And we actually care about music. So you can have your distinguishing taste when it comes to Shakespeare versus USA Today. But don't touch our taste in music. Which is a way of saying, don't talk about things we think are important. You have your own weird ideas about what is important and finally valuable. You can talk about that all you want. We don't care about that. But don't talk about what we think is important. And that question of taste, why put Homer in front of a student? Because Homer is the best. We will put in front of them what is the very best. That's what we aim to do. That's why we talk about the leaders in history, the people that made the decisions, why they're the most important, because they resolve a conflict, they determine what comes next to some degree. It's not up to them to decide which of the historical characters or events are the most important. We're there to tell them what is. And what ultimately results, and we know how this breaks down with the decline of the liberal order. There is no one in a position to tell the hungry what they should be fed. No one has that general recognized authority that is necessary to be authoritative as a teacher. And that's why more exclusive sets are necessary for education. You must have a loyalty, an adherence, a solidarity in a group. And that's something that many of us are talking about over in the Old Glory Club, and recently with our friend Dave the Distributist. They've been talking very constructively on that. Dave even said just recently in his most recent show with the Cascade Society that we have to be, or we should be, more intentional about who we can do things with so that we can build these kinds of communities. These things are necessary to preserve the things we most value. We must coordinate because, as Aristotle says in the Politics, the isolated individual is as inconsequential as the pawn in chess. We have to be able to coordinate in groups so that we can have things like education that will elucidate the values.
Well, Bagby, I think that we are fast approaching time. We'll have to have you on again to discuss this at length when I'm feeling a little bit better. But I'm really glad to have had you on. Where can people find more of you and more of your work?
Yes, indeed. I have a Telegram channel called Bagby's Corner, where I'll publish my thoughts. I'm really more active there than I am on X. You can find me on X at Tallman Books, and I am a publisher. I've got a number of new books coming out. I just submitted a book for a new series today. I've got a new series on lawmen and outlaws in the Old West, and I hope to announce the publication of that first title later this week. You can find my works on www.tallmenbooks.com, MEN, tallmenbooks.com, where you can find all the books I've republished. That's my business. It's always a pleasure to come on. Thanks a lot for having me.
Of course, very much glad to have you. And everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever.